All right. Yeah, thank you. Nice to be here. Hope everybody's doing well. It seems like we have good representation from a lot of the universities who are participating in AI Leaf, and that's great to see. Um, and also, I think we have a good representation of people who are kind of in the domain science relative to people in the computer science area. So that's excellent. One of the things we try to do in AI Leaf is to pair, students from a domain area of science to a computer science area. And we found that that works really well in terms of like, identifying problems that are real world problems that need to be solved, identifying strategies for solving those problems using computer science and machine learning or AI, and helping students learn more about the different cultures and vocabularies that are used in our different areas of work. I hope to do some of the same things here today in my talk. So that's kind of what I'm planning to do. And I'll share my screen and go into the slides. Basically, what I'm talking about here today is decision making in digital agriculture. And anybody who's managing a farm has to make a lot of decisions, what seed to buy, is it corn or soybean seed, what cultivar, what type, how to till, when to plant, how to irrigate, when to irrigate, when, where, and how to apply fertilizer, manure, or crop protection products like herbicides, when's the best time to harvest. So all these decisions have to be made, over a given time scale. Some of them are day to day, some of them are week to week, some of them are months or even years in advance. And the key thing today that I want to focus on is decisions also depend on where you do things spatially. So each field is divided into different soil types, different slopes, different productivity zones. And so rather than managing fields uniformly, which is not very efficient, today a lot of farmers are interested in spatially varying their management. And these decisions have to be made using a variety of information. Could be elevation, soil type, crop yield, fertility, remote sensing. And synthesizing all that is kind of difficult for a person. So increasingly, we're seeing artificial intelligence being used to identify patterns, look for hot spots, look for anomalies, and to help in making better decisions. So there's always uncertainty in making decisions because we can't know the system completely. But the better information we have, the better our decisions are going to be. So yeah, that's kind of the basic focus of digital agriculture. And more specifically, I think for precision agriculture, we want to know what inputs to apply at the right time, at the right location, and the right rate. So these are all spatially varying decisions. And they could include all of the examples that I'm giving here. There are trade-offs between, the productivity of the farm, sustainability with respect to the environment, and profitability. And so those also come into play in the decision-making process. And, farmers have a large number of alternative practices that they could use. And so evaluating what is the best decision is not a very easy thing to do. So with, artificial intelligence applications in precision agriculture, we use a variety of data. We have the data layers I showed here, elevation, soils, yield, fertility, satellite imagery, drone imagery. But we can also leverage historical management data, farmer intuition and observation, public data, mechanistic models, and all of those can be leveraged using AI. And then the third thing I want to say is that digital agriculture is a little bit broader than precision agriculture. Precision agriculture generally focuses more on what you do on the farm, whereas digital agriculture includes that, plus, you know, a lot of advanced data processing techniques to integrate all steps along the value chain from, um, production to processing to marketing. So this aims to optimize the production, increase efficiency, enhance sustainability, and improve decision-making through the whole value chain. And there are several steps that have to be taken to do digital agriculture in the right way. So you have your data collection, which could be sensors, it could be remote sensing, it could be soil sampling. You have pre-processing and cleaning of like yield data. It could be, mechanistic models that involve different outputs, different, like yield versus nitrate leaching. And we have to put weights on all of those to see what's most important. We select models that give us outputs that we're interested in. So some models can't do that. If we're interested in, productivity, sustainability, as well as perhaps, management of insects and pests. Some models simply can't do that. And so we have to choose our models based on the needs we have. And then we'll evaluate the model against data and we'll deploy them for better decision making. These models could be used to, drive robots through the field to vary rates of fertilizer or to control weeds. The models could be used to track the sustainability of all the operations that are being implemented on the field. And they could be used to estimate the footprint, the carbon footprint, for example, of all the farms in the supply shed for a large multinational company. So those are just some of the possibilities. So a natural question is, how do people in agriculture feel about the prospects for using AI? And so Bruce Erickson, one of the members of our ai-leaf team, he does a survey every year of all the crop retailers in the country, and he compiles the answers to those questions. And this last couple of years, he's been asking about AI. So the particular question here was, how do you feel about the use of automation to increase the accuracy of crop input applications, such as pesticides and fertilizers? 55% of the respondents said yes, we think that'll be a really important tool. Do you think automation will reduce mistakes in making applications of products on the farm? 54% said yes. Do you think automation will reduce the labor needed? 31% said yes, meaning 70% said no. And this is a big kind of a myth in some respects. A lot of people in the general public have this perception that AI is going to reduce the need for farm labor, and most of the people who work in agriculture know that that's not true. Another question: will AI lead to better recommendations? 45% said yes. Will AI reduce my need for employees? 16% said yes, but again, 84% said no. So actually, there's a lot of people who think that they'll need to actually hire new kinds of labor that is knowledgeable about AI. Will AI reduce operational costs? 20% said yes, 80% said no. So these are some interesting answers. And then another survey was done by David Ebert at Oklahoma State, and he was more interested in the particular tools about AI and whether they've been used or not, and if they've been used, you know, what was your feeling about them? So there were a large number of respondents who said yes, they've heard about AI, but they hadn't used it. Around 600 in total of the nearly 1,000 people who were surveyed. And then 300 people, roughly 30%, said yes, we have heard about it and we have used it. And then depending on the region you're in, so example, in the Midwest, the blue color, 29% had a relatively favorable perspective on the use of that tool. And so we're seeing greater adoption. Now, the adoption is in areas like auto guidance for tractors, early detection of crop stresses, variable rate application of fertilizer, modeling crops as they grow and extracting the traits of those crops. And then the types of tools that are being used are listed over here on the left. So we have a whole range of different AI and machine learning tools, ranging from less complex at the top to more complex on the bottom. And I'm going to go through all of these and give you some idea of how they differ from one another, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and we'll talk a little bit about some examples from each one of those. Oh, before I do that, the USDA Agriculture Research Service, which does research on agriculture and natural resources, is actually doing a lot of work in this area to develop new tools that then can be adopted by companies and implemented by farmers. So it spans a whole range of different kinds of activities that you can see here. So it's not limited to just a very narrow area. It's including soil, food safety, aquaculture, animal health, crop production, crop protection, plant diseases. So I just think the breadth and depth of all this is key. Now, before I get into the details of the AI tools themselves, I think it's important to talk a little bit about some terms. There are a lot of new terms coming up with AI, and the language is sometimes confusing. So when we talk about AI modeling, you'll see these terms. So one of the terms you'll see is modality. Modality is the type of data that an AI model can process. And this generally includes things like text, images, charts, sensor data, videos, satellite imagery, model output from, crop models. And different kinds of AI tools are more suitable for some of these types of data. And I'll talk about that later on. So when we say we have a multimodal AI model, it means it's incorporating or fusing data from many different sources. And with that, you can get a lot of outputs that you couldn't achieve with a single modal AI model that's only using text, for example. The next thing I want to talk about is labeling. So when we develop an AI model, we have to do some training of the model. And there are different approaches for doing this. So One type of labeling is called supervised learning, where you have, say, photographs in a field or images from a field, and you know what's in that image. For example, it could be a nitrogen deficient crop. It could be a picture of an apple tree with apples on it. And so you can actually identify what it is in the photo that you want the AI model to learn. Okay, so that's called supervised learning. On the other hand, a lot of the newer models use what we call unsupervised or even self-supervised learning, where there's no labeling whatsoever. And the AI model is just trying to distinguish features in the image, which later on, by fine-tuning the model, you can identify more accurately. So that's a key difference between models, is whether they use labeled data and supervised learning, or unlabeled data, unsupervised or self-supervised learning. Okay, now then another example of a term is feature space. And so, for example, if we have, so if a feature is a multidimensional space, each dimension in that vector represents a feature or an attribute. And every data point in a data set has, the dimension of that feature space. So for example, a satellite remote sensing image with a spatial resolution of 30 meters for a pixel, covering an area of 100 pixels by 100 pixels, so 10,000 square pixels, with one image every 2 weeks for a period of 5 months, and reflectance in the red, green, blue, and near-infrared spectral bands would have a feature space of 100 by 100 by 10 by 4, representing X, Y, time, and spectral dimensions. So we have 100 X dimensions, or pixels in the X direction, 100 pixels in the Y direction. Those pixels are each 30 meters large. You don't put that in the feature space. We have 5 months over, and every 2 weeks over 5 months, so that's 10 weeks. And we have 4 spectral bands. So every data point we have is characterized by one of those X and Y coordinates, one of those weeks, and perhaps one of those spectral reflectances. And you can graph that in the input space. Okay, and then if you have multi-features, those features change over time. So they evolve. And that structure changes over time and space. And that's what the models are trying to learn. So it's a kind of abstract idea, but it's an important concept. So information that has higher features is generally more comprehensive, and you can generalize your results more easily when you have larger feature spaces, as opposed to narrow feature spaces where you're looking only at, a very, very short spatial and temporal resolution with only one reflectance band. Okay, the next topic is feature selection. So then the question is, which feature is it that's going to really be most relevant for my modeling? If I have all that information, somehow my model needs to identify what is really causing, the output, like crop yield, that I am interested in predicting. Is it the data in week 2? Is it the data from spatial location, 50 by 50? Is it the information in the green band? So with feature selection, you basically try try to figure out, which part of your data set you need to put extra weight on when you're doing the modeling. And you don't want to just throw everything into a model and then give them all equal weights, because that will end up not being very predictive. So feature selection assesses and ranks the correlation of each independent variable with the dependent variable, which could be yield. And through a recursive process where you select the most important features and then combine them with others, you identify how combinations of variables perform, and you select the most effective performing variables. Okay, so once you do all that, you can train your model. And you feed the data, you adjust the parameters to select the best features, you select the best combinations of features, and you have to do something in terms of minimizing the error between the output from your model and the observations that you have. So you might have inputs of weather, soils, crop yield data to learn how to predict spatial and temporal variability in crop yield, and you would want to find the best parameters to do that. So normally you take about 70 to 80% of your data to do the training. And then you would have 20 to 30% that you'd hold out. And you would then test the trained model on the remaining data to see how accurate it is. So for example, if you had a AI model that was trained on crop yield data from farmer fields collected between 2001 and 2010, you could test that model using crop yield data from the same fields for the next 10 years. You could also go through a process of validation where you could use the trained and tested model with data from 2020 to 2025, and you could hold out maybe 50% of that data and do some more training, and then do validation on the remaining set. So that's an additional layer of training. So this is really important in terms of making sure that the model is trusted by the user and that it's accurate. Okay, any questions on these terms that I've defined?
David, I have a question about your previous slide, or the one before that. Is it a useful exercise, because to talk about like number of data points here, like we've got 100 pixels by 100 pixels, each pixel having an RGB near infrared, and then of course we've got it over time.
Right.
That feels like a really powerful illustration of just how much data can be included in just like a single image.
Right. It's a lot of data, and this is a relatively small example. So in many machine learning and AI models that we develop, we're looking at millions of data points. So if we're talking about a model for the entire US, you would generally be looking at a huge, huge data set, which is why these models, take a lot of time and energy to train and test.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to try and minimize my screen here and then go on. So let's go on now to talk about specific tools. The first tool is kind of an old technology. It's called Support Vector Machine, or SVM. And so here, normally what you might have is the interest in taking a data set and dividing it into two classes. So one class could be what you're interested in, and the other class would be what you're not interested in. So for example, if you're talking about crop yield, you might be interested in areas of the field that have more than 180 bushels per acre of corn relative to other areas that have less than 180 bushels per acre of corn. So you go through your data set and you reclassify all the data into zeros and ones, which is binary. So 0 would be less than 180 and 1 would be greater than 180. And then you try to find a hyperplane in the data set that separates the classes. All right, and this hyperplane would cross over space in the field. So it would generally be, a way of separating the areas that have greater than 180 from the areas that have lower than 180. And what you're trying to do is examine a series of lines through the data. These are the hyperplanes, and to maximize the distance from this hyperplane relative to the centroid of the two classes. And you can, so for the dashed lines, you're seeing that this dashed line on top is too close to the class in the plus signs. And so that's not optimal. So you need to move it farther away, closer to the red dots, which you're trying to separate. The other dashed line is too close to the red dots. So, that's not the optimal hyperplane either. It's the bold line that really represents the optimal division between these two classes. And then I try to identify the data vectors on the nearest hyperplanes to that optimal hyperplane so that you get an idea of how far apart you are from the optimality. So an example that I'll show you later is, if we have a data set of observations of numbers of aphids on soybean leaves, we might be interested in whether we should spray the field for aphids or not. Now that requires knowing whether the population of aphids is more than 650 aphids per plant or not. And so we can create a binary field where any plant that has more than 650 aphids is given a 1, and any plant that has less than 650 aphids is given a value of 0. And then you try to find the hyperplane between those two classes to determine how many observations are above the hyperplane and how many are below. And that tells you whether or not you need to spray. The advantage of support vector machine is it's very resistant to outliers. So you could have one of these blue data points over in the red field, just because of the spatial location. It could be an outlier surrounded by lower yielding land. And that doesn't influence the result too much. You can tolerate a little bit of outliers. The disadvantage is this is a difficult model to calibrate. You have to calibrate it by changing parameters in the model that adjust the location of this hyperplane. And that's a tedious and time-consuming process. All right, so now let's go to more modern techniques. One of those more modern techniques is called artificial neural networks. And this consists of interconnected nodes called neurons with layers of neurons that are in input layers, output layers, and hidden layers. And you can increase the number of neurons depending on the complexity of the task. So the input layer receives your data. The output layer is where you get your result, and the hidden layer is where you do the training and the testing. And there's a learning process where you go forwards and backwards to adjust parameters until you get the right connections between the data and the outputs. So you're trying to minimize a loss function, which is like a mean squared error between the predicted outputs and the ground truth labels. This is supervised learning. So you could, for example, estimate crop yield based on precipitation, temperature, soil type, and vegetative indices from remote sensing. That's a very commonly used technique, which was developed, 30 or 40 years ago. There are some more modern updates to this procedure, one of which is really transformative, and that's called deep neural networks, or DNN. So it's a type of artificial neural network that has multiple layers of interconnected nodes between the input and the output layer. So the information flows like it does through the ANN, through the hidden layers to the output layer. There are nonlinear transformations allowing for a learning process for the complex patterns. The thing that differentiates it from the artificial neural network is the depth, meaning the number of hidden layers. And so you can capture a lot of features about the process that wouldn't be possible with the artificial neural network. An example here is, trying to basically take images to identify weeds in a field using a deep neural network model. So you take the photos, you try to separate the crops that you don't want to spray from the weeds that you do want to spray. You go through training and testing, and then you develop a little robot that goes through the field, and it variably applies herbicide only to the weeds, so you're not spraying the whole field. That ends up saving a lot of money for the farmer. There are some other special cases for these deep neural networks, like convolutional neural networks for image analysis, which is shown in this example. You can also use a you only look once type of tool that can identify objects if you have supervised learning. There are visual transformers, which are more advanced, that are like segment anything models, which work with more complex features. And then if you have time series data, so for example, you're interested in development of fruit over time, you would not use a convolutional neural network, you would use a recurrent neural network. The difference is that the convolutional neural network works best for data that varies in space, whereas a recurrent neural network works best for data that varies over time. All right, so let me give you a few examples of recurrent neural networks. This is a type of artificial neural network that handles sequential time series by maintaining the memory of the previous state. So for example, someone asked about soil moisture. RNN is a good tool for modeling soil moisture because you need to know the moisture content on the previous day, as well as the rainfall on the previous day, in order to predict the soil moisture on the next day. And crop growth is another example where you need some kind of memory. So it works the same way as some of these other neural network models. You have input layers, you have hidden layers, you have output layers, and these are all time dependent. So these, the X is your inputs, L is your output, and then the hidden layers evolve over time. And so your inputs and your outputs also evolve over time. And that's the basic difference between an RNN and a CNN, or convolutional neural network. So again, you're trying to find the right weights and the right biases, the right feature selections to give you a good model. There are some permutations on this to help address some of the weaknesses of the RNN. One is this long short-term memory, which is a type of RNN. And the key feature here is it doesn't retain all the memory of the previous state. It forgets some of the information that's not necessary for a good prediction of the final output. And this reduces the memory requirements of the model so that you don't have to have as large a computer and you don't have to handle, you don't have to have as big a processor. So it overcomes the limitations of the traditional recurrent neural net, where basically the data that was memorized from a long time ago gradually vanishes in the RNN. That doesn't happen with the LSTM because it puts special weight on remembering the important information and it forgets the older information that's not useful. All right, so let's go now to a third sort of permutation on the RNN, which is gated recurrent units. So this also has memory, but it combines the forget and the input gates into a single update gate. So it treats the information that was forgotten as input. And that, again, saves memory, making it faster to train and to do the computation. So these are kind of nuances that, aren't really that important to focus on. But I wanted to make sure that you had some idea what the different types of tools are. Now, one of the big breakthroughs that has recently happened and which ai-leaf is really focusing a lot on is this idea of knowledge-guided machine learning, KGML, where we integrate principles from physics, like conservation of mass and energy, with the traditional recurrent neural networks that do time series modeling. So you can do modeling of streamflow, which is a time series based on evapotranspiration, soil moisture, snow depth, and these are all time varying processes. You can calculate your streamflow and then check against a process-based model of the same stream to see if the precipitation minus the evapotranspiration minus the runoff equals a change in soil moisture storage, which is an equation for the conservation of mass. So by constraining the output to conservation of mass and going back and retraining the model, if it doesn't meet that criteria, you get more accuracy and better interpretability. All right, then the last set of tools would be the large language and the foundation models. Large language models are trained on text and language. So ChatGPT is a good example. ChatGPT sucked up all the information on the internet, all the books, all the research papers, all the different, alphabets of the world, all the novels of the world, all of that was sucked up into ChatGPT and then trained to understand the context. Foundation models, on the other hand, do something similar on a large scale, but they include both text, audio, images, data, and sensor signals. So they're much more comprehensive than large language models. Both large language models and foundation models are what we call Gen AI, and they can be used to generate new information, which is obtained when a user asks a question about something they don't know. And then the co-pilots and the chatbots provide answers if they have the right context. So these kinds of tools are becoming really revolutionary, and they are being used in agriculture as well. So to kind of summarize all of this, I put together a table of the strengths and weaknesses of the different approaches. And so you can look at, they do have very different strengths, ranging from classification to deep learning to time series learning, to knowledge and conservation of mass and energy, to generative AI. And then they also have weaknesses. Some are weak for complex large data sets. Some require a lot of fine tuning to make them, work well for specific applications. And so I've talked about some of these weaknesses as I was going through this. So I'll stop here for a minute and then see if you have any questions about this segment of the presentation.
For the FM models, so I saw the weakness is that it's using large databases and needs to fine tune. For a specific agricultural system, or let's say a region, so the Midwest, for example, could you limit the database to just like scientific papers from certain journals you approve, or information that like you approve, or is it have to be full internet information? Like, can you fine tune? It's like, okay, I know this data set or this database is information that I would like to be used, or is it just like we have to use the full
No,
internet?
you can definitely customize these chatbots and Gen AI. So on ChatGPT, for example, you can load specific articles that you're interested in. And companies are doing this. So for example, Bayer loaded up all the extension documents that they could get their hands on for the Midwestern United States and trained their own customized Gen AI model to give their clients recommendations on the types of products that Bayer is selling their customers. So they have their own database of, internal documents, and then they leverage the extension databases to do their own customized training, and they're selling that product now to their customers, and it's working really well. That was a great question. All right, so you guys know what you're talking about. Let's go on now to show some success stories. I talked about Bayer. That's the Gen AI Copilot, and I talked a little bit about how they trained it. John Deere has a product called See and Spray, which is shown here. It's a way of using computer vision to spray only the weeds in a cornfield so that they don't have to, spend as much money spraying the whole field. And of course, there's less environmental impact. Syngenta has an app for seed recommendations. So they are able to allow their customers to find what hybrid of corn, for example, might be best for the geographic location, the soils, and the climate that the customer is living in. IBM has a weather forecasting foundation model that is now able to do a very accurate job of giving 10-day forecasts. So a farmer now can predict the weather 10 days in the future with very high accuracy using this model. Whereas if you're interested in, predicting out to longer time intervals, the accuracy goes down. And so over time, our ability to predict weather in the future has been increasing quite a lot. Okay, now an example from my own research is detecting soybean aphid infestations. So here's a map showing areas where soybean infestations were a problem. And we developed a satellite remote sensing technique to identify whether or not fields were above or below a threshold of 650 aphids per plant. This overcomes the need for a person to go out in the field and look for aphids, which is very time consuming. And we can look at the whole Midwest, whereas a scout who goes out to an individual field only looks at about 10 plants. So they're not looking at the whole field, let alone the whole Midwest. We can do weekly imaging, and we can use this model to identify which fields need to be sprayed and which fields don't need to be sprayed. And this is a huge cost savings for farmers, because any of the fields that are above this threshold could have yield losses, whereas the other fields, really the aphids are there, but they're not causing economic damage. Another example is early detection of diseases in wheat. This is research done by my colleague, Si Yang, and she used hyperspectral remote sensing and trained a deep learning recurrent neural network model to look at wheat disease development over time. And she could identify specific heads on the wheat stalks and determine whether or not they were diseased or not. So if you can identify this disease early, then you can spray the field to overcome the disease. That saves the farmer a lot of money. A third example is detection of yields of fruits. So you can detect the fruits, and then with advanced computer vision, you can estimate the volume of the fruits to get an estimate of yield. This is a difficult task because some fruits are hidden by leaves, and there's a lot of clutter. And so basically, this technique that we're showing here is just convolutional neural networks, but there's a foundation model now that's been developed by Meta called Dino, or Dino, I don't know how to say it. And we're fine-tuning that model using labeled data to do this job at a higher accuracy. So Dino basically could say, I can recognize that these are different features. That's a pole, that's a leaf, that's a sky, that's ground, that's a shadow, that's a fruit. But Dino doesn't know what they are. So we have to go in with specific images to fine tune the model so that it then knows what the objects are. The last example is knowledge-guided machine learning, where we take process-based models and deep neural net models and combine them to do a better job of prediction. So you can see that the red line with our knowledge-guided machine learning matches observed data for nitrous oxide fluxes because it obeys conservation of mass, whereas other techniques have very low accuracy. And with this technique, we can have high predicted power over the entire Midwestern US for things like carbon dioxide fluxes that satisfy conservation of mass. And we're using very sophisticated architecture here with gated recurrent units and knowledge-guided machine learning. So then as we wrap up here, I just want to give an example of how the chatbots are now currently being used. The top example here is a foundation model trained on images that can detect different kinds of agricultural objects like, growth stages, fruit types, what kinds of diseases we have. And this is now very, being used very heavily by a lot of companies for early detection of problems. In answer to the previous question, yes, some of these LLMs have been trained and tested by ingesting specific information and harvesting the knowledge of lots of technical expertise. And these LLMs have been tested against agricultural exams that are given to humans who have to pass an exam to get certified. And these chat box have actually answered questions very accurately. So you can see different versions of GPT are improving. The improvement is even better when you add context. Like, okay, I have this photo and it was taken in Minnesota in August. So that context of where it was, what month it was taken, helps the chatbot to give a more accurate answer. So that's retrieval augmented generation plus context. And so that concludes my presentation. I think it's a lot of information to digest, but hopefully this gives you some idea of the tools that are available, the terminology that's being used, the kinds of problems that are being solved, and what kinds of advances are being made in these areas. So thanks so much for listening. And if there's any last minute questions, I'm still here. I don't have to leave right now, but if you have them, feel free to ask or to put them in the chat.
Thank you so much, David. This was really illuminating. I was frantically taking notes because so interesting. Do we have any questions from our scholar team here?
Has anybody used any models like these?
Maybe some of your advisors or colleagues have?
All right. Well, I hope you learned something new in this presentation. If you have questions that you want to ask later on, feel free to contact me. Here's my email address.
Great. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
We'll stick around a little bit for any other questions. And next week we will have someone come speak with us about the ethics and equity in AI and use in agriculture and forestry. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, David, can I pick your
You-
brain for a second?
You should
Sure.
stop the recording.